Hello, thank you for joining us today for our distance advocacy workshop. I'm Susan Dixon. I'm your state chair of government relations, and I'd like to introduce Jennifer Baker.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Baker. I am a legislative advocate with Murdoch, Walrath, and Holmes, and I am here to make sure that everything CalRTA would like to see take place within the halls of the legislature and over at CalSTRS are accomplished.
Thank you. Yes, and today what we're going to do is we're going to go over our distance advocacy section on the CalRTA website that we just recently retooled, and how we can continue to advocate through distance advocacy and moving forward with our elected officials. Next slide, please. We're going to be covering our new CalRTA tools.
And I'm going to shut off my webcam.
And I'm going to shut off mine. And we are going to move into the next slide. We're going to cover the CalRTA tools that we're providing you that have been updated on our website. We have a new section with a toolkit for virtual advocacy to make it easier and seamless for our members to be able to contact their elected officials. Jennifer is going to be covering the updated state budget and legislation update, which has been changing on an hourly basis. So that's always going to be an interesting section. Next slide, please. One of the major areas that CalRTA has been doing the last over 90 years is advocating. And we've changed from driving down the dusty roads to now a virtual advocacy method. COVID-19 put us all into a mode where we immediately had to change how we were going to advocate for our members, how we were going to stay in touch with our elected officials, and how we were also going to stay connected with our membership. So recently, the three of us worked on, with the help of Debbie Pate Newberry, updating our sections on the CalRTA website. The Action Advocacy section is the main section that is on the home page that will give you all the tools and information that you as a member or non-members can access to be able to get the materials and resources to connect with our elected officials. On the right side of this slide, you can see that we recently redid the website. It's very seamless now. It's cleaner. It has the three areas at the top: division resources, virtual advocacy toolkit, current legislation. When you go to the resources under each of those, you're going to get a large number of documents and materials and information that you can access that will be updated as it is needed. Below that, we have basic talking points, facts and figures, again, materials to distribute, and this and that. These materials are key in the fact that we are now unable to meet in person with our membership, but that doesn't mean we are not connecting with our members. So we want to be able to provide them, get them to use the website on a regular basis and to be able to access these. Next slide, please. You can see, for example, under Division GRC Resources, once you click on the resources, there are a large number of materials that you can access. This changes as needed, as I said. So the second one is now our new push for the WEP GPO repeal. It's called the Summer of Advocacy. To be able to share with our membership, what are we asking from them to do this summer? We have retooled it so that you can see the Summer of Advocacy tools are 3 regular weekly legislative alerts. Tuesday is Take Action Tuesday. It is directed toward repealing the WEP GPO by focusing on contacting 10 members of the Bipartisan Women's Caucus. I change those every month so that we are continually emailing and alerting them to this cause. We've retooled the Wake Up Wednesdays to be for our state issues. And as you noticed, the last couple of weeks, we were focusing on asking the governor to be sure that there were not cuts to the public education system. And then on Thursdays, that again is focusing on the repeal of the WEP GPO, and we are contacting key members of the Ways and Means Committee. Next slide, please. This is an example of just some of the materials that you can access and use, and you can print from the website. When we were able to meet, these 3 documents where we would share with our elected officials. These are powerful. When they want to know the cost, you can see from the graph, it's a very simple amount. It's a very small amount of the annual Social Security output. This was a suggestion from Representative Linda Sanchez to not just talk about the actual money cost, but the cost in relation to the output. If you look at the next slide, another suggestion is what we've been using, the scenario. Some of our elected officials would say things like, why teachers in 15 states did not pay into Social Security? Why would they be eligible for the spousal Social Security? We showed them that in other cases in the private sector, women or spouses who did not pay or meet that 40 quarters were already collecting spousal Social Security. Truly, personally, I believe this is one of the things that changed a few of our elected officials' minds that had not been co-sponsored. When we shared these materials with them and talked about it, they were able to see it in print. And now more than ever, since we're going to have to advocate through virtual advocacy that I'm going to be going over, you want to be able to have these documents sent ahead of time so you can speak to them. Next slide, please. The next slide is just, again, shows you some of the documents that we have access to as members. How do Social Security penalties hurt teachers? You can download, print this if you were meeting in person. If you're not, you can download and send the PDF to your elected officials. And then the next slide, please. There's many more documents, by the way, that you can access. Under current legislation, this is where I really rely on David Walrath and Jennifer Baker as our legislative advocates to keep us up to date on what the current legislation is, ever changing under our state and our federal. The legislative alerts are the alerts that we send out on a weekly basis. If you are not receiving them, up at the top, it will ask you to sign up for the email alerts. If members aren't comfortable signing up, they can always go to these legislative alerts. They are now archived. Debbie Payne-Newberry has done a tremendous job helping make this seamless, simple, and easy for all of our members to be able to send a legislative alert to their elected official. If you go to the next slide, you can see once you click on the legislative alerts, where it says join our mailing list. If you're not receiving them, please sign up. There's no advertising, there's no situation where you're going to be hacked if you're receiving a secure email from CalRTA. When you go and you see, for example, the Tuesday alert that's listed email today, the second one, if you weren't able to do it on Tuesday, you were out of town or you were just busy, you can archive this. Click on that. And the next slide, please. Once you do it, it automatically populates. Here are the representatives. On the Thursday alert, we have Nancy Powers, who's Chairman Larson's staff contact. You click on her name and you can see over on the right, it populates into your email. The message is there. All you have to do is simply sign your name. Easy breezy. Next slide, please. We are changing, as we said, ever more each and every week. One of the easiest way to contact elected officials if you are not their constituent, is to do it through Twitter. We have this on the website where you can actually go and find out how the directions are to set up a Twitter account. If you wanted to contact Mitch McConnell, we're not in his area. You go to his website. You're not going to be able to write him any information or a request, but you can do it through a Twitter account. We have an easy to use step-by-step guide. If you go to the next slide, please. And we actually have sample tweets. When you're asking, who is my legislature? I'm always getting emails. Who is my representative? Who is my state senator? I always will help you find those. It's simple. You know your zip code. On our website, you go to this section, find your representative for the state, for the federal. Click on it with your zip code. You'll find out who your elected official is. And then the next slide, please. We also have on the website the California State Senate calendar. One thing Jennifer and David have been very good about apprising me of is this has changed a lot. So we hope it's up to date, but because of COVID-19 and the way that a lot of our elected officials are meeting, this may not be up to date when they're in their office. But that's the beauty of virtual advocacy. Someone's always there responding to an email. They still receive those emails. Next slide, please. The most recent section on the CalRTA website under Advocacy Action is our Advocacy Toolkit. Jennifer and I worked the last couple weeks and decided it was really important to be able to have all the materials and instructions that you need to be able to advocate virtually. We're all on a computer. We all can access this information simple. And there's no reason you cannot request a meeting with your state assemblymen, your state senators, your congressperson, your state senators, and your federal, and our two senators, Feinstein and Harris. You can do it now through a virtual Zoom request. And the next slide, please. You can see once you go there, we have these sections. Tips for advocating. Here's a distant meeting checklist. How do you find your legislature? Again, it's repeated from another section of the website, but it's right here if you're on virtual advocacy. I want to set up a meeting. How do I do it? We have a sample email meeting request you can copy and paste. We have the talking points. We have a lot of the documents you may want to send if you're doing a state or a federal issue. We review the do's and don'ts of lobbying. And then most important, we go over the CalRTA Advocacy platform. And the major situation that we always try to make sure that our elected officials and our members know, the CalRTA Advocacy platform is driven by our members' needs. We have the 4 sections and areas that we focus on: CalSTRS retirement, federal issues, mostly concerning the WEP GPO penalties, healthcare and healthy aging, and public schools. That is what we advocate and legislate for. The platform defines those. Every 2 years we do a survey. You will be all receiving a survey in September. It will prioritize what are our members' needs and wants. That is how the platform is written. The next section, if you look at the federal part on the CalRTA, that's fine. You can see, again, all those handouts are there. We have the WEP GPO repeal handouts in color and in black and white. Because in color, when we meet in person, if you're having a division meeting or an area meeting, it's really cost effective to print it for members in black and white. When you are printing it for an elected official, I always recommend we use color. Next slide, please. Again, you can see this is what's listed in the CalRTA Advocacy Toolkit. Everything you need to be able to stay connected with our elected officials. Today, more than ever, it's imperative that we advocate on a regular basis and in mass. When we wrote the new ledge alerts to request that the WEP GPO is put into one of the stimulus plans or the penalties be suspended, it came from Rodney Davis's office. He has been trying to get HR 141 into a stimulus plan since it began in April. So we decided we'd help him out. He's the author of HR 141. Very important, and we hear it from all of our elected officials when we talk to them in Zoom meetings and emails. If you want to be heard, you need to do it on a regular basis, and you need to do it in mass. So that's why we're asking all of our members to become more familiar with our website, how to advocate virtually, when our representatives come home in August, how to set up a Zoom meeting so that you still stay connected with our congressman. We have to remember that the push for the repeal is essential to continue and do now. September and October begin. Our elected officials are going to be very concerned with re-election or election. A lot of situations and a lot of new legislation is going through Congress. We don't want them to forget about the needs of our membership. And the next slide, please. You can see again, we're just going through simplifying. What are you doing in advocacy? You can request a video meeting. You can send an email. You can still use the phone. It's imperative, though, to remember if you want to meet with your elected officials, you go through the system, they will set up the Zoom meeting, and they are usually very encouraged to be able to get members and constituents to speak to either staff or the elected official. And I'm almost sure they're more active now meeting virtually through Zoom than to try and catch them in person. So remember that for upcoming August.
Suzie, can I add a little note onto that aspect? So this is Jennifer, and one of the things I want to encourage you to also be aware of is there could be some differences between how your federal representatives want to meet and how your state representatives want to meet. Some of your state representatives may actually want you to put together the information for a video call or a conference call, or some of the offices may do it themselves. So it's going to be very important when you have a conversation with them to try to find out what they believe is going to be the best way to move forward, and then work to try to accommodate that. And if you need help in trying to set something up, we're here for you to help make that process more easy.
That's correct. Thank you, Jennifer. That is so on point, because there is it, and everyone is learning and moving into new modes. So we have to be flexible and receptive to how they want us to meet. If you go to the next slide, as Jennifer said, we are here to help. CalRTA has a Zoom account. We have GoToMeeting accounts. The Government Relations Committee has a GoToMeeting account. You need help setting up an account, a meeting for a state official, we're here for you. Just contact one of us. Key of reminding yourself now, we did this for years when we advocated in person. We always went over, what do you do before you meet with the elected official? What do you do during the meeting? It hasn't changed that much. So we need to be educated and proactive that you want to still follow these guidelines. Study your legislators' website, know how many people are in the affected area. That's key. We can get the information of retirees on the CalSTRS website. It's very powerful to say, did you know in your area you have, 11,000 active teachers and 4,000 retired teachers? Really brings it more as an important issue when you're able to share how many of their constituents are affected by whatever issue you're presenting. Same thing when you go into a video call, all of these key areas. And if you need assistance and you want to learn more about it, we're going to be having more webinars just about the website and how you advocate virtually. Next slide, please. And I think this is the most important thing. This is going to kind of move into Jennifer's role. If you have been involved in government relations, or if you're new to it, it's important that we know that we move through the legislative advocates. This actually, if you go on the right, they analyze the legislation and they present the recommendation to our committee if we ask them. They tell us exactly what the legislation means and what implications it will have. Then the Government Relations Committee reviews the legislation, ballot propositions. We've been doing virtual meetings now for 3 years, but all of our meetings are virtual. So we have legislative meetings that are virtual. Our committee makes a position recommendation. I then present those recommendations to the CalRTA Board of Directors. These arrows it should have moved the other way. And then once I present it to the Board of Directors, our CalRTA Board of Directors makes the final decision on the committee's recommendations. When we're looking at legislation, again, we look at the platform. There's thousands of different pieces of legislation, state and federally. We rely on our legislative advocates to find the ones that are only addressing those 4 areas of our platform. So in the next slide then, that goes into Jennifer Baker's role as one of our legislative advocates. And she's going to go ahead.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Susie. And before we actually go into the next part of the website, we're actually going to do a little poll. We're going to be doing 2 polls today. And the first poll that I'm sending out to you is, do you receive the CalRTA alerts? Can you take a moment, click on whether or not you receive the alerts, whether or not you take action, and make sure you click the submit button. You have to click the submit button in order for everything to go through. What we're trying to do is to get a better idea of what we can do to ensure that we're as effective as possible with the alerts going out, and most helpful for you and all of our members to make sure that, that we're as responsive as possible. All right, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to close that poll. And thank you so much. It looks like 12% of you receive the alerts. 79% of you not only receive the alerts, but are taking action. 9% of you don't receive the alerts, but as you've seen on Susie's presentation, we've now walked you through what you need to do to receive that, and we can make sure that we're sending out information so you can ensure that you can learn how to sign up to receive them if you would like to get that. So thank you for that. We're going to do one more poll at the end of my presentation, and I did want to let you know, because I forgot to mention it earlier on. If you have any questions, please write them in the question box in your which is on your toolbox on your screen. We do have a section for questions. If you have any, please write your questions down, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible in the question and answer section of our website. So with that, I'm going to go into the state budget and legislative update. I'm going to first start with legislation, and then I'm going to close with the budget. And I do have to let you know that this is literally up to date. So you are actually going to be one of the first groups that's actually hearing what is actually going to be in the components of the budget that the legislature's voting on within the next 48 hours as negotiated with the governor. So this is really good, juicy gossip from Sacramento I'm going to be sharing with you. But first, let me give you some other fun gossip, and that's going to be legislation. So I first wanted to tell you about some of the bills that CalRTA has been active on and what's happened during the legislative process. The first bill that I wanted to know was SB 795 by Senator Bell. And initially, CalRTA had taken an opposed position because what this bill would have done was take property taxes from local schools, saying, don't worry, we're going to pay you back from the general fund, so we won't actually do you any fiscal harm. But what we knew from experience during the Great Recession was that when legislators promised us that they would never suspend Prop 98, we found out that they lied, because they actually suspended Prop 98 twice. What happened was districts were actually more reliant on their property tax revenue when Prop 98 was suspended. We also knew it was likely we could potentially go into another economic decline. Surprise, surprise, look what has happened. So we said, no, we need to oppose this bill because we can't take a chance of you taking away one of the few tools that our districts have to try to keep themselves whole during an economic downturn. Let me just say that Senator Bell did not appreciate those conversations, but nevertheless, CalRTA and other education advocates held firm, and we were able to convince Senator Bell to amend his bill so it no longer impacts school property taxes. So that was a huge win because it could have impacted literally hundreds of millions of dollars cumulatively at the local level. So that was a huge victory. The next bill that CalRTA has a support position on is SB 956 by Senator Jackson. And what this bill would help to do is bring additional transparency and accountability to California's tax dollars and how they're being used. And a lot of folks might say, well, what does that have to do with schools? The reality is 40% of every dollar of a tax credit or a tax exemption is actually money that would have gone to schools. So when you create a tax credit, you are literally subsidizing that tax credit with education dollars, which means if you're going to spend money on a tax credit or exemption, you need to make sure that it's justified, it's achieving its goals, and from a policy perspective, that it's okay to use those monies for whatever this economic goal is, as opposed to funding kids in schools. So what this bill would do is create a board that would view all of the most expensive corporate tax credits that California has spent money on in the last decade. And just in the last decade, the 10 most expensive corporate tax credits alone, just the top 10, have cost California more than $85 billion. And let me remind you, this was literally during the Great Recession. So while we had a recession, we were suspending Prop 98, we were cutting money from schools, from healthcare and social services, we were still funding corporate tax dollars, corporate tax credits. So the hope is that it will ensure that our tax policy is more in line with the long run, to ensure that we're not spending money where we should. But this bill would actually not eliminate any of them. It just ensures that a board that's going to be created is going to make recommendations to the legislature on whether or not these tax credits are actually achieving the goals that they've been out to achieve or not. And if they haven't, then perhaps the legislature may want to change that for some, or if some are achieving their goals, then they can certainly continue the work that they were doing. So this bill has been moving forward. This bill was literally just passed off the Senate floor yesterday. So I did not update it, but you should know, Susie was right. The legislature is getting a lot of work done. So the bill is now, it's in the process of moving from the Senate to the Assembly. The next bill that I'm going to cover is AB 683 by Assemblymember Carrillo, and this bill is a measure that CalRTA has supported. And what Assemblymember Carrillo is trying to do is she's trying to ensure that those that need to utilize Medi-Cal services are going to have some of the constraints that make it more difficult for them to become eligible for Medi-Cal, to try to eliminate some of those constraints. So what it says is that you don't have to take certain assets and resources. So when you would have to count a car, different life insurance policies to determine whether or not you are Medi-Cal eligible, that will no longer have to do that, because that can be very prohibitive. You might have a life insurance policy or a car, but if you're actually forced to sell your only car in order to be Medi-Cal eligible, how are you going to get to any of the appointments that you're going to have? It just doesn't make sense. So Assemblymember Carrillo is trying to change this bill. Granted, it would be subject to federal approval, but what they're trying to do is change the conversation. This bill has very recently moved from the Assembly to the Senate. And just so you understand, so remember back in the 80s, there was the cartoons on the TV about "I'm just a bill." So if you hearken back to how a bill becomes law, you first have bills have to move from a policy to a fiscal committee, have to be passed by a policy committee, then passed by a fiscal committee, then they go to the House. So Assembly bills go to the Assembly floor, Senate bills go to the Senate floor. Once they pass each of their houses, they then switch houses and have to go through that same process in the other house. If they make it through both houses, they get to pass go. Nobody gets $200, but the bill then goes down to the governor for determination. So we are at that point in time where we're now seeing measures move from one house to another. So that's just what's happened with the last two bills. And the next bill I wanted to talk about was AB 2100 by Assemblymember Wood. Assemblymember Wood is the chair of the Assembly Health Committee. He has been very intricately involved in a number of discussions which have been taking place around the healthcare arena. And what he's trying to do is trying to make it easier for individuals to get their Medi-Cal prescription drug benefits. So what he's doing is making a number of changes regarding the Department of Healthcare Services in order to provide supplemental Medi-Cal ingredient cost reimbursement. So basically what happens is a lot of pharmacies, they're not actually putting the prices that they're paying for when they purchase the ingredients for prescriptions. And so what happens is the person that's actually getting the prescription winds up paying a higher cost. So you're paying an inflated cost. So what he wants to try to do is ensure that those costs are not going to be inflated as part of a broader effort to try to reduce overall prescription costs. This bill has also just moved from the Assembly to the Senate. I'm going to be going over a few more additional bills. It's been a very busy year, but actually, let me take a quick moment to pause and just say we actually had quite a few more bills that we were involved with, but when the legislature took a break and they took their pause because of the pandemic, when they came back, they said, we're going to make a determination not to move bills that are not directly related to the pandemic or to the economy or to some urgent need that California needs to pass right now. So many of the bills that CalRTA had taken positions on, the pause button was set. Those bills then stopped moving forward, but it is likely many of them will be reintroduced next year. So that's one of the reasons I'm not going to be covering as many bills as you might typically see. I just wanted to make sure that I made that note so you understand why are some bills moving forward, but maybe I heard about another bill. How come I'm not hearing it here? That is primarily the reason why that would take place. So with that, the next bill I wanted to cover is SB 852 by Senator Pan. Senator Pan is the chair of the Senate Health Committee. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to also address the overall issue with prescription drugs. And so what he's working on doing is creating a new office of drug contacting and manufacturing within one of our state agencies, which is the California Health and Human Services Agency. And ultimately what he wants to accomplish through that is to try to increase competition, and which would then ultimately lower prices, while also addressing some of the shortages in our overall market and economy for our generic prescription drugs. So overall, what he's trying to do is address some of those systemic issues that we have with the lack of affordable prescription drugs or a lack of available generic prescription drugs for our California consumers. This bill is on the Senate floor. The Senate is actually meeting all this week. They're literally meeting as I'm speaking right now. So it is possible that this bill may be coming up as I'm presenting. But whenever we do the next legislative update, we'll definitely see what is going to happen with that measure. And then the next measure,
No,
AB
you're
2471
bugging.
by Assemblymember Manchison, is a bill that CalRTA also supported. And what this is trying to do is it's trying to protect seniors by providing more time for you to have the right to cancel contracts if you're 65 years or older, from 3 days to 5. For very, very complicated contracts, such as if you're looking at buying or selling a home or changing your home mortgage, a very broad contract that you might be entered into, having a new heater installed or a new air conditioner, something that could be extremely expensive, life insurance policies. Oftentimes, it's very complex sometimes to read through fine print, and we have seen an increase in individuals trying to take advantage of our senior population. So what this bill would do is provide a little more time from 3 days to 5 to try to mitigate some of those issues of exploitation that unfortunately many of our senior populations have had to deal with. This bill has also just moved from the Assembly to the Senate and will likely be heard very shortly. We just have a couple of more bills until I go into the budget. Two more bills. Assemblymember 2219 by Assemblymember O'Donnell. This is a measure that was sponsored by CalSTRS that CalRTA supported, and what it would do is it would authorize CalSTRS to offer an IRA in addition to a Roth IRA, and allow them to be able to accept rollovers. Some of you may already be aware that CalSTRS has a Pension 2 program, and that allows our teachers to be able to utilize Pension 2 as an alternative to other 403Bs that are out there. And they have a number of different supplementary products that our teachers can invest into to have an additional retirement mechanism when they retire. So this would allow CalSTRS to provide an additional tool in the toolbox to help teachers to be able to save for retirement and therefore have a more secure retirement. Unfortunately, this was one of the bills that was pulled because of the refocusing on COVID-19, but we have been in communication with CalSTRS about plans to reintroduce it next year, depending on what's happening with the legislative process. Now, the last bill that I wanted to talk about is something that CalRTA wound up being extremely involved with, and that's AB 2998 by Assemblymember Kiley. CalRTA opposed amendments that were being planned to be dropped into a bill. It's called a gut and amend, and you might, another way to think about it is Assemblymember Kiley was trying to pull a fast one, and what he wanted to do was to, at the last minute, drop amendments into a bill that literally would have eliminated the CalSTRS defined benefit pension for new educators. So eliminate retirement security. This would impact the majority of women because 72% of CalSTRS members are women. It would have had a very detrimental impact on trying to recruit and retain teachers. There, I could go on and on. And so we found out what Assemblymember Kylie was going to do, sent out a legislative alert. So one of the alerts that Suzie was talking about earlier, if you were to click on those alerts and see what happened in the past, what CalRTA did, you could see the alert that went out. And we had so many CalRTA members calling the Assemblymember Freddie Rodriguez's office, because he was the chair of the committee that would have heard this bill, that his chief of staff got my cell phone number, called me and said, oh my gosh, all the phones for our office are transferred to me because no one can be in the office and I can't get any of my work done because your members keep calling. And he said, I have to tell you, your members are some of the most effective advocates I've ever talked to. We're not going to hear the bill. You can call them off. Please call them off so I can get my work done. That was a huge success. So thanks to our CalRTA members, we were able to not only keep this bill from moving forward, we were able to work to make sure that it never even saw the light of day. And that was all because of the great work that you had done. So thank you so much for that. If some of you that are on this webinar were some of the individuals that made contact, it really made a difference. And it helped to not only secure a good retirement for our current and future teachers, but by ensuring we have CalSTRS members always coming into the system, that helps to ensure that your own retirement is protected. So you not only helped others, but you helped yourselves in that process as well. So let's get to some juicy gossip, shall we? I know folks always love to hear about what's going on in Sacramento. So I wanted to let you know that the budget is literally being voted on tonight by the Senate, the California Senate. So here's what happened. The legislature passed, I don't want to call it a phony budget because they did a lot of work to get there. But the governor had proposed in the May revise a very draconian budget. It included over $8 billion worth of cuts to education alone. It would have really slashed and burned. And he created the May revise with the philosophy, let's cut the budget now, but if we get additional federal funding, then we will use that funding to bring those programs back. And the education community, we've had a number of conversations with the legislature, Department of Finance, and governor said there is no way we can reopen schools. We're barely able to function as is. If you make all these cuts, you're virtually guaranteeing not only can we not really open schools, but if you still force us to, we can't provide a safe environment for kids physically to keep them safe, and we can't also provide a safe learning environment for them to learn. The legislature listened, and the legislature pushed back to the governor and said, Governor, we're going to call your bluff on this. We are actually going to assume that we are going to get federal funding, and we're going to create a timeline, and if we don't get that federal funding, then we will make some cuts in other parts of the budget. But when it comes to the education budget, instead of making cuts, we're just going to institute deferrals. So they did pass that budget on June 15th, which is a constitutional deadline to sign a budget. And then the legislative leadership met with the governor, and they essentially hashed out a new budget. And that new budget is what you're actually seeing here. It was literally just released earlier this week. Not all of the components of the budget are even eligible to be heard until tomorrow. Only 2 of them are eligible to be heard tonight because of various legislative deadlines and rules that the legislature has to follow. But tonight, it's probably going to be around 9 o'clock that the Senate is actually going to vote on some of the major components of this budget package, and the Assembly is coming in tomorrow. They're going to come in at 1. Who knows what time they're going to finish? I mean, I'm making bets with people on whether the Senate's going to finish by midnight or not tonight. But the reality is, it's very likely by the end of the week that the budget will the compromise budget will be passed by the legislature. Once that happens, the governor is going to have 12 days to sign the budget. Since this has already been a compromise budget that's been agreed to between the governor and the legislature, there is a possibility that the governor may choose to sign it early next week before the start of the next fiscal year, which is July 1st. So that's just a little bit of extra gossip behind the curtain in Sacramento on how we got here. So the highlights of the budget and what it includes, this compromise budget does assume that we are going to get approximately $14 billion in federal support. The timeline that was created in this budget assumes that if we don't get the money, or if the federal government does not give us additional funds, and if it doesn't happen by October 15th, then there are going to be a series of triggers and reductions throughout the budget. Fortunately for education, as I noted, we're not going to get budget reductions, but we are instead going to get budget deferrals. And I have to say, education really made out. Let me correct that. K through 14 education really made out, because our UC and CSU systems are going through a series of potential cuts. And also there are a number of areas within healthcare, within social services, throughout other aspects of the budget that are going to potentially look at very devastating cuts. But there are a few notes in there that I just wanted to make sure I shared. If we get less than the $14 billion that this budget assumes that we would get at the federal level, then essentially we're going to get proportionate reductions to a series of items. There's a list that the legislature provided, and the deferrals that are going to be in place for our K-12 system as well as community colleges. The deferrals might wind up being even larger if we get less than $14 billion at the federal level. So that is kind of where we are with the federal support and what we're likely looking at in the future. The budget that was created doesn't assume that we are going to end the day with approximately $11.4 billion in total reserves. So even making cuts, we still have additional funds and reserves. And the way some of our rainy day funds actually work, so Prop 2, the way that's set up, which is one of our rainy day fund, you're actually only able to take out a certain amount each year. And the legislature and governor are trying to continue to have a cushion, because there is an assumption this is unfortunately not going to be an overnight recession. And that sure is a shame. So despite that, the legislature and governor are also setting over $700 million aside for additional emergency funds to address the pandemic. And as many of you may have been hearing, we are seeing significant increases in the number of Californians that are testing positive, and we are beginning to see a strain on hospitals. The governor is also indicating that the state may begin to actually slow down the opening up that was being planned. So we don't know exactly where this is all going to go, but we do know that there has been an economic cushion that's being put together to make sure that California is able to address all of our needs. So on to healthcare. So the good news is that there are some cuts that were not going to take place, but there is some bad news to healthcare that CalRTA was watching and trying to support through the legislative process. There was a bill that CalRTA did take a support position on, and it would have created the Office of Healthcare Affordability. And when the governor had presented his January budget, he had also proposed creating an Office of Healthcare Affordability. And so we were involved in those conversations saying, this is a great idea. How can we be helpful to make this happen? And And unfortunately, when the economy began to tank, this was recommended not to move forward in the May revise, and that was one of the aspects that the legislature did agree with because it would have been a new cost. So unfortunately, that idea has been stalled. We hope that we might see that come back sometime in the near future. And similarly, this had also been the same kind of discussion when it came to the state conversations about creating its own state generic drug label. In the January budget, the governor had proposed creating a state generic drug label so that we could provide Californians with more affordable prescriptions to try to address some of those systemic needs. And unfortunately, this was also something that's been paused because those would have been new costs. But this is certainly a conversation that I know is very important to CalRTA members. And so we're going to be watching to see where those conversations are going to go. But I did want to provide the unfortunate bad news that those two wonderful items for discussion are being paused for right now. But some good news when it comes to healthcare is the May revise would have proposed eliminating over $54 million in funding to provide various services through Medi-Cal benefits. And that would have been funding to provide adult dental, optometry, optician, audiology, and a number of items. They were going to be cut. And we just said, this is not the time to be cutting healthcare for seniors in this aspect. And those conversations were all successful. So I did want to let you know, while there is some unfortunate news in the healthcare world when it comes to the budget, that there are still some rays of sunshine that are gleaming out there. And so we'll continue to look out for some more of those that we can share with our members. When it comes to taxes, I did know in legislation, AB 956. So I wanted to remind you of that conversation because this is in direct relation to that. The May revise had recommended that we suspend some tax credits for 3 years. In order to save the state some money, because as I noted, 40% of revenue that's created for these tax credits or that's taken away from these tax credits is money that would have gone to schools. So a number of groups have been having conversations with the legislature over the last 2 years saying there needs to be more education about this issue because it's not something that stakeholders are aware of. It's not something that the legislature or a lot of governor staff are aware of. And this is having a major impact on the lack of education funding. So fortunately, the folks in the governor's office paid attention during those conversations and said, hey, we're going to pick out a couple of tax credits and we're going to just suspend them for 3 years. They're not being eliminated, but just by suspending these tax credits for the next few years are going to generate cumulatively over $9 billion from the state over the next 3 years. And education is going to see over 40% of the funds from that, because then that means we're not subsidizing these various tax credits with education dollars. So that's great news, and that helps to minimize the cuts or reductions and additional deferrals that we would see for education. So I am going to be bringing these issues up more because it's very important to understand tax policy, because there is a direct link between tax policy and education funding. But let's save that for another day. Let's first go into the education budget and say that ultimately the education budget is not as bad as it would have been in the May revise. So that's very good. It doesn't mean it's perfect, but it's certainly better than it would have been. So first, we are receiving additional one-time federal funds, and those come from the CARES Act that many of you may have heard about, and that's to help deal with learning loss, particularly for our students with disabilities and low-income students, English learners, and foster youth. So our schools will be able to utilize that for direct costs. We're also getting an additional $1.4 billion in ESSA, elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds that are going to go directly to our schools based on their Title I allocation. we're also going to get cumulatively around $100 billion for this current fiscal year for 2021. So 70.5 billion of that is specifically coming from Prop 98. So when we look at the total dollars that are being provided for schools, what that means is we're going to get a little over 17,000 per student. That's okay. Is that the highest in the nation? Certainly not. We have a long way to go. And additionally, we might even get an additional $6.6 billion if we see some additional federal aid. So that might bump up that $17,000 number a little bit, but that's essentially where we are when it comes to funding. The compromise budget did reject the 10% reduction to the local control funding formula. So that would have been that $8 billion in cuts that a lot of you had been hearing about. That was rejected. Unfortunately, though, this compromise budget does deny a COLA for the LCFF. That was a big item that we were hoping would stay included in the budget because, as you know, costs are increasing for schools in a number of areas. So if you don't provide a COLA, then that means you're kind of eroding the overall budget. But unfortunately, the legislature was not successful in keeping that in the compromise budget. A few other aspects with the education budget, it provides billions of dollars in deferrals, but in addition, it also is doing some deferment in paying. So essentially, instead of paying us on June 30th, it pays us on July 1st. So by doing that, it's kind of an accounting trick in order for the state to be able to save some funds. But then it also includes billions of dollars in deferrals. So if we don't get the additional federal funds that the state is asking the federal government to provide, then we're going to see our local school districts having to institute a number of deferrals. But there are additional provisions because some small school districts may have a very difficult time in getting those deferrals instituted at the local level. So there are providing additional funds, about $300 million, to help make that happen and provide assistance for some of the smaller local districts that might have a difficult time with that. But some of the trade-offs that were included, because our schools are not getting the cuts that other parts of the budget are getting, one of the trade-offs is that the legislature and governor are prohibiting any layoffs for certificated and classified employees. They're saying, schools, if you're not getting cut like other areas of the budget, then we're not going to let you cut staff. Also, because they're saying, well, you're going to need those additional staff because of social distancing. But this has been a controversial discussion in the world of school management, who is saying, wait a second, you're tying our hands and eliminating some of the tools that we have in order to address some fiscal needs. So this was a very colorful topic, as I'm sure that you can understand, whether you're listening, if you were a certificated member or whether you were an administrator or a superintendent, you can understand this was a very colorful discussion, and this is now part of the budget compromise that's going to be moving forward. And that is specific to the current budget year, which is 2021. It also provides a hold harmless provision for schools, meaning that they are going to get funded for the amount of kids that they have had this year. And if they lose more kids, their budgets aren't going to be cut for this year, because they are anticipating we're going to see some shifts of kids moving around districts, or perhaps going to homeschool. And so they want to make sure that districts don't suffer economically because of that. There are a number of additional short-term, both fiscal and academic issues that the legislature and governor are providing flexibility for, and to recognizing that with distance education, it's going to be a lot more difficult for them to check many of the boxes that have been set out to be checked. And then finally, a big win is we're seeing a $645 million is being provided for Prop 98, specifically for special ed, and a $545 million increase to the special education base rate, which is huge, as well as $100 million for the low incidence disabilities pool. And for those of you that either worked doing school budgets or have worked in special education are intricately aware that that we're just not funded for the true cost of special education from the state or the federal government. It really has a major impact on school budgets. So the fact that we're going to see increases there is really going to be a powerful economic tool in the fiscal bucket for our local schools. Many of you have been, may have watched the webinar that Dave Walrath and I did a few weeks ago in regard to retirement. So this might be a refresher. Some of the numbers have changed just slightly, but we are seeing a total of $2.3 billion that's going to be savings to school and community colleges because their CalPERS and their CalSTRS rates are essentially going to be reduced by about 2% for the next 2 fiscal years. So that is being provided by taking some of the extra payments that were made to CalPERS and CalSTRS in last year's budget. They're saying, well, let's take that money back, and instead of making an extra payment, let's just use that to make the school district's payments for the next 2 years to provide them an additional cushion. And let me say before I move on from that, your retirement will not be impacted. Your retirement is secure. It is guaranteed by the California Constitution. If you didn't get a chance to see the webinar that Dave and I did, if you go to the CalRTA website, scroll down, there's a new webinar section. You can click on that section. I'd encourage you to watch that retirement webinar because I specifically go over a number of aspects about your retirement and how your retirement is secure. So with that, I wanted to put a pause. We have one more poll that I wanted to provide as a query, and then we're going to move on to questions. So I first wanted to share next wanted to share this poll with you because we're trying to anticipate additional aspects that might impact our schools next year. And here's the question. Were you planning on working as a substitute teacher this next year? Yes or no? Because what we want to find out is whether or not the pandemic and whether or not the new restrictions that are happening with schools might impact whether or not you choose to come back as a substitute teacher. Because we know for those that we know there's a sub shortage, but we also know that if you were planning on working as a substitute teacher and you are age 65 or over, because of the impact of the pandemic, that might your your safety might be more important than getting the extra funds. And don't forget to click submit if you haven't clicked submit. And I want to thank you for that. We're going to go ahead and close the poll. And let's share with you. So it looks like 89% of you, most of you were not planning on substituting, but 9% of you were planning on substituting and are going to planning on continuing. But 3% of you were going to substitute, but are now not going to. And what we're trying to do is anticipate some of the issues that might come up next year, because just because of the pandemic doesn't mean that the teacher shortage has gone away. And in addition to that, and I'm going to turn my screen back on, in addition to that, we're also anticipating that because school districts are so overwhelmed right now with trying to figure out how they're going to reopen schools and what that's going to look like at the local level, they're not able to think about, are we going to have enough teachers? Because we're also trying to anticipate, are we likely to see more teachers retire so you don't have to go back? And then suddenly districts are going to have to scramble for a substitute teacher, and are they going to be available? So thank you so much for that. So we did want to share with you
questions.
And while we're doing questions and answers, if you look on right behind Suzie and I, we've got additional webinars that are going to be provided by CalRTA. Suzie has been working on quite a bit of information, so you're likely to see more. I'm actually going to be doing a budget webinar next week. So shortly, that's going to be announced in the next day or two. So please take a look with that. You did receive the preview, but I am going to be going into some of those issues a little more deeply.
And
So with
on that note, I'm also going to be doing a webinar on navigating the website and virtual advocacy. So I go more into depth on how to make it easy for you to be able to use our website on a regular basis. I was looking at some of the questions, and I'll do a couple, and then I want to kick them to you, Jennifer. But the big one that always comes up is email signups. And it was a good question. Why do I have to sign up? They already have my email. Why doesn't it go to all the 40,000 members? Thank goodness for Johanna and Angelique. They answer my emails like that. And if your email is on your personal information, then Johanna has it. You should be receiving the email signups. I know one of you said that you're constantly having to re-sign up. Please contact Debbie Pate Newberry and Johanna. If you need their emails, email me, and they will help you get re-signed up and figure out what the issue is. Sometimes we accidentally kick ourselves out, and so they need to help us get back in. Another member asked, how many bills have we previewed? We preview a lot more usually, but this recently we did 33 bills, and we're going to do 3 ballot measures, take positions on at our next GRC meeting. And the school opening guidelines, there's a question about, are we going to take a position if certain districts are either changing the distance regulation or doing things? This all comes from the state as far as guidelines. When we start looking at situations is when it hits the platform with the funding or the health of our students and our teachers. So we'll be going into it more specifically, but unfortunately at this time from the state, it's just become recommendations. So it's always important to stay on top, and I will follow up, and Dave and Jennifer, with the Sonoma County regulations. How many attendees today? We had 35 attendees. And then the big key question, I know Jennifer will even go into it more at her next webinar, is explaining deferrals. And I always call it kick the can. So can you briefly explain deferrals to our participants?
Yeah, I'll do it very briefly. And let me also note, because there are some very good questions out there, and we're already past time. So there isn't going to be enough time to answer all questions. But what we are going to do is take all of the questions, and we're going to make sure we provide answers to those questions. And we'll make sure that we get that information on the website and provided for you. And if any of your questions were budget related, I'm going to make sure that I actually answer those as part of my presentation when I do the budget webinar next week. So thank you for helping me anticipate some of the questions that people might have. But just to do a very brief snippet on deferrals before we close it up, a deferral basically says we're going to allow you to borrow money at the local level. So we're not going to pay you. You go figure out how you can borrow money. But guess what? It costs money to borrow money. So the reality is, while school districts are going to go out and they're going to figure out how they're going to get that money, they're going to have to pay interest. But they're only going to, let's say there's $100 million that you go out for that says, we're not going to pay you $100 million, but you have the ability to go borrow $100 million. Well, when the school district pays back the $100 million that they borrow, they have to pay back a lot more than $100 million. And when the state pays the school district back, they give them $100 million. So guess what? Now there's a gap. So deferrals do cost money at the local level. Legislators and politicians in Sacramento don't like to acknowledge that. So essentially what it does is create a gap for our local districts. At the same time, if you had to ask the question, what's worse, having a deferral and having that gap, or having straight up cuts?
Right.
That's the quandary that we've had. So that's it in a nutshell. But thank you to the person that asked that question. I'm going to make it a point to do a lot more of an explanation in my workshop next week. I did want to say thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I have to tell you, Suzie is working day and night and on weekends.
Oh, well, so
to
do
make
you,
sure
because
we're
I
up to
bother you.
speed.
But we do want to also remind you to look at the CalRTA website for the upcoming webinars, because it is a lot of information today. So we're going to split it into two. And then we also have the lunch chats. I'm going to have a lunch chat on Tuesday at 11:30 just to talk about the government relations group. So thank you everyone for coming, and we definitely will get back, and we do have another question, so we're going to answer all of them. So.
Yep, we'll make sure that we do that. And you can always contact me or Susie individually, and we would be happy to help you with anything that we can. Thank you so much for taking time out on Thursday, and we hope to see you again in one of our upcoming webinars.
I have an announcement for everyone. The attendees will receive a follow-up email that will give you another opportunity to ask a question. And if you had your hand raised, we weren't able to address them. So if you don't have time to write your question under the question column, then you can put it on the email that you will receive. Thank you, both Susie and Jennifer.
Thank you so much. And I hope that you all have a safe and happy weekend.
Happy 4th too.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye. See you.